Here in October, it is National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and around the corner, I have Lee Clasper-Torch with the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence and 10 Men. He's going to come on in, tell us a little bit more about 10 Men. Come on in. And the upcoming 4th Annual Men's Summit. Lee, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. You've got the information literally here at your fingertips.
In my hands. Right.
So we've seen some stuff on social media. Wanted to bring you in. We ran the editorial, the opinion piece this week by Deborah DeBear about it being National Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but you have a unique role with 10 Men, and specifically the role that men play in talking about preventing, having a dialogue around their role in preventing domestic violence.
Yes. Yeah, so Kate, I'm the Men's Engagement Coordinator for the Coalition Against Domestic Violence. That means that I facilitate and help coordinate a project called the 10 Men Project. The Coalition is part of our prevention program for the Coalition, actually getting men engaged in this issue and enlivening and empowering them to break the silence around men's violence against all girls and women.
So how did this start, and why 10 Men?
Yeah, the project is in its 5th year, actually, so it's this is the 5th cohort. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment, but 5 years ago, the 10 Men Project program was sponsored by and actually has been funded by the Center for Disease Control, which is quite interesting because the Center for Disease Control, of course, CDC, working on health-based issues, realized that domestic violence and abuse against women is a health-based community issue.
Yes.
So they've funded us, and 5 years ago that was funded for the project, which involves getting 10 men together each year in a cohort and working to engage them, to educate these men, and to then empower them to go back into their communities and break the silence of men's violence against women. Now, whenever I'm talking about this with folks, I will say this, that many times people think that men's engagement work that I'm doing involves batterers and abusers, and in this case it doesn't. So I'm working with the Coalition Against Domestic Violence to engage professionals, community leaders, men in all walks of life around the state of Rhode Island to actually get off the bench, get in the game, and to break the silence around this pervasive problem that we have. So.
And you talk about the silence. I mean, having 10 Men is really to have that conversation, as you said, with these individuals, to bring it to the broader community. What does day one look like when you have them there? I mean, what is really the conversation starting point with 10 Men?
Well, basically, first I want to say it's incredible the men that we get coming to the program and putting themselves out there. Basically, it's a community service ask for them. So we have men coming from all walks of life in Rhode Island, professional men working in all kinds of professions in the community, and they're community leaders. So what we're trying to do is engage them, orient them, and actually create a sense of community, a sense of camaraderie, a sense of empowerment, so that they can go back out into the various spheres of influence, we would say, back into their workplaces, into their community, into their neighborhood, and actually engage and start conversations around the culture of violence that seems prevalent. So the 10 Men Project, it should be said, is really, Kate, to involve ourselves with changing culture around men's violence against women and girls, changing what might be called the socialized norms around gender. So that's what we're doing. We're engaging. We have an orientation meeting. Actually, what happens is that each month we meet on a monthly basis. We invite the men to come on a regular basis. We educate, do some curriculum, awareness raising, and then we engage them in the community in various capacities.
So if people see this and they see 10 Men and they kind of wonder a little bit, the role of men in preventing domestic violence, is there any misconceptions, if you will, about the role of men? I mean, if they are indeed the batterer, if they are indeed the catalyst for domestic violence, what are some of the messages that you are really looking to get out in terms of the role of how men can play a role in stopping this?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. First, I should say, along with that question, that the Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the 10 Men Project realize that the majority of men are not violent and do not enact violence on girls and women. And yet, the preponderance of domestic violence, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, is men on women violence. So while the majority of men don't engage in violence, what we find is that many men tend to be silent about it. So while we're not engaging in it, so what we want to attempt to do, Kate, is change the culture to invite men, encourage men, in fact, to, if you will, break the silence and work against the cultural norms, gender norms that are so prevalent, that prevent men often from speaking up as bystanders. One of the things we realize as men in this culture is that we're often painted in a box. So we like to call it the man box. What does it mean to be a man? So we all grow up with this kind of cultural, socialized identity that to be a man looks certain ways, right? What we want to do is bring men into the conversation to break some of those socialized norms, which tend to then lead towards violence and often impacted on women and girls. So.
Now, I saw some men that I know on social media talking about 10 men, talking about the upcoming summit, men that I have a huge degree of respect for. So wanted to bring you in to talk about the summit. It's the 4th annual summit. You've, again, got information here with you.
Yes.
Who should think about attending the summit?
Thanks for asking. This will be our 4th annual men's summit. So the 10 Men Project and the Coalition Against Domestic Violence has sponsored a men's summit for Rhode Island for the past 4 years. This is our 4th year. We're inviting men from around the state of Rhode Island, any and all men, and those who identify as men, to come together to have some discussion. It's actually hosted by Providence College, which is great. They've hosted it the past 3 years. It's wonderful. There is a meal. The event is free, but what we're really doing is attempting to create, again, a wider culture, concentric circles of men who care and are concerned about these issues. So last year, each year, it's actually grown. So last year it doubled. We had over 60 men, close to 70 men. This year we're expecting probably closer to 100 men. So it's a dynamic event. It's an evening event. It's November 9th. The doors open at 5 at Providence College, 5:30, things get going, we have a good meal together, and then we do some conversation. So many men have actually said this summit has, for the first time, enabled them to have conversation with men, again, across cultures, across all walks of life in Rhode Island, that they hadn't had before about these very important issues. So we give that space for that. It's a great networking event. It's a time where men can get together and say, what can we do to stem the tide of violence against women and girls?
Do you find that participants often or can include men who have witnessed domestic violence, whether against a sibling, whether against a mother, whether men who have been in situations where they have witnessed it and said, we need to break the cycle?
Yes, I'm really glad for that question. Because as I said earlier, the men that I'm working with are not batterers or abusers, but many of the men, Kate, that have come to volunteer to be a part of this 10 Men project are men who, by their own story, have said that they grew up in and witnessed in their own households violence happening, domestic violence and abuse against women and girls in their family. And so because of that history for them, they've been moved and inspired to actually get involved and break this cycle. So I'm glad for that question. So that is what motivates some men, not all men. But there are many men that have come in the 10 Men Project that have experienced that. Yeah.
Now, you've got to register prior to this, right? Is that, if I recall?
Yes. So
we'll have links up for you.
That would be great. So go to the links that Kate's going to put up. It's also at the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence website. You're able to go there to the 10 Men page of that. There's registration. We like to collect information for the registration, get a head count and numbers. It's absolutely free. All men are welcome. So please go and register and join us.
And take a look and see who the 10 men are who are participating at this time. You
Yes.
might know them. It's Rhode Island. Lee and I know it's a very small world.
It is. It is. So you can go to the site. You can see the 10 men. Actually, for the past 5 years, we have photographs of the men that have involved themselves in this, and again, coming from all walks and professions around the state of Rhode Island, leaders, many of whom you would know. So please feel free to get in touch with me. Register for the summit. Get in touch with me if you have any interest in being a part of the 10 Men Project.
And, this must be the kind of one of the big events for you on your calendar for what you're preparing for throughout the year. But the conversation keeps going. I mean,
does,
it's just a one time that folks can get together, but it continues social media, picking up the phone,
Yes.
meeting with someone. I mean, is that
Yes.
part of it too? I mean, you see so much of it in media written about how girls go and do their girls' night and sort of do their girl stuff, and men might not necessarily have those sort of connections that make them feel that they can open up and talk about things like that. And this must help in that regard.
Right, it does, and again, that's a great question and a great point. We're trying to create spaces. The summit is one space, and as I mentioned to you, when we have the evaluations after the summit, many, many times men are evaluating saying this is the first, if not the only time, they've had a space where they can sit around a table where there's conversation about these important issues. So we're creating that space. The 10 Men Project creates that space outside the summit too. The summit is the once a year, October, as Kate has already mentioned, is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So we have our summit in October around and close to. This year it's in November 9th. But we create conversations. So what we're attempting to do in the culture change we're doing, Kate, is to fan out and seep into our communities and create spaces where men can share more openly and honestly this way, as well as men can, someone said once that silence is the voice of complicity, and I think all too many of us as men have been complicit in violence that's been enacted on all girls and women quite often. So we're trying to break that silence. We're trying to empower men to be able to do that in various ways. So.
And I have to imagine this applies to the next generation of men. So if men are talking with
Right.
boys and what it means to be a man,
Mhm.
I mean, is that a part of it? And, leading by example, saying, this violence does not have to be part of the male makeup.
Absolutely. In fact, the summit, I should say, spans generations, which is interesting. We don't have very young boys, but we've had college students all the way up generationally, and they also speak about how it's important to talk cross-generation, cross-culture about these issues. So there is a mentoring component to it. In breaking the silence about violence against women, what we're attempting to do is actually, from the other side, is create a healthy masculinity, to try to move against what might be called toxic masculinity that we're all caught up in. So how to create that healthy masculinity, how to be models for young boys and men around healthy ways of being and healthy gender manifestations. So.
Well, again, it's the 4th annual summit, especially right now with all we're hearing with Harvey Weinstein and sexual assault and men and culture and it just seems like a very, it's always a timely issue, but when people start talking about, the treatment of women, whether it's abuse or assault, it's clearly at the forefront of something that needs to be talked about.
Yes, and actually, just to that point, it's clearly, it's in the news now with Harvey Weinstein, of course, and I think this is one of the things that is disconcerting is that one of the myths is that domestic violence only happens in certain areas of our culture, in certain socioeconomic classes, but it happens across culture, across class, statistically, and also the issues of power. Of course, the Weinstein issue raises issues of power, and also that women in all areas of life are exposed to this kind of abuse.
There's been, again, a large conversation taking place, and this is, as has facilitated the conversation, continues to do so. So just wanted to bring it to you, the viewer, that, again, this resource is there. The summit's coming up. Well, the date again?
November 9th. November 9th. Yes.
November 9th
Thursday
at PC.
Night at Providence College.
Some great men, some great food, and some
Yes.
important conversation. Again, this month is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, but of course all year round looking for ways to engage the community. So Lee, I appreciate your taking the time to come in today.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully we'll see you soon, but we'll have some links up there for you. Again, this is the 4th annual Men's Summit.
Yes.
Again, with 10 men. Lee, I appreciate your
Join
coming
us.
in today. Okay, we'll
Thank
put the links up for you. I'll let you go around the corner and
Thanks,
I'll
Kate.
welcome my next guest on. Lee Clasper-Torch with the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. He is the Men's Outreach Engagement Coordinator, works with 10 men. Again, this is the group of men in the community who are working to, amongst themselves, talk about the issue of masculinity and violence and again, to break out into the larger community. Appreciate him coming in for this very important topic, as everyone needs to discuss this. And as he said, silence equals complicity, so let's talk about it.